one at the same time universal, but also highly particular and unique. This leads to the construction of so-called practical identities. The practical identity is the name given to the individual who is at one with their social institutions and regard their well-being as tied directly to that institution, even though their link to the institution must be one that is voluntary or voluntative. As Fred Neuhauser states, quote, an individual comes to have a standing in civil society then only by stepping into determinate particularity, that is, by taking on a determinate and exclusive identity that both makes him or her into a particular someone and distinguishes him or her from the majority of his or her fellow members of civil society. The identity acquired in Hegel's conception of the ethical system distinguished individuals qualitatively from one another. They were at the same time thickly social in content. And according to Hegel, that's the moment that citizens become spectators. They also simultaneously, according to Hegel, as citizens become spectators, they are also simultaneously transformed into citizens. But one can imagine in something like slavery, the institution is impossible to get out of. And so being at one with the institution would not help you, but may lead to a nihilistic moment at that point. Social freedom and egalitarianism share idealized versions of democracy and citizenship, relying on Hegel's idealized non-race community of persons and John Rawls's egalitarianism based on a distributed resource model that is agnostic to enduring social hierarchies. Philosopher Elizabeth Anderson lays out a compelling view of egalitarianism and pushes back against Rawls's version of egalitarianism by stating that egalitarian concerns are primarily about social relations, not distributive justice. After all, Jim Crow was about separate but equal, and that version of an egalitarian society was deeply stigmatizing and problematic. Why? Because figuring out how to create equality in parallel worlds was extremely difficult, and in fact, exposed inequities within the so-called separate but equal system. Anderson outlines the systems of hierarchy that function as blockades against an egalitarianism that we want. The first would be domination and subordination, unaccountable power. The second, hierarchies of esteem, where inferiors are objects of shame. Stereotypes are used to enforce these regimes, racial, ethnicity, caste, etc. The third is hierarchies of standing, where rights need to be respected, cases where only certain groups count. These are elements of what she replaces as the primary drivers of egalitarianism, not distribution of resources. Now, egalitarians wish to replace social hierarchies with groups of equals, and there are some corrective measures and actions they advocate as pathways towards a more egalitarian condition, including democratizing the workplace, making it easier to convert cultural capital into wealth, decentralizing power, etc. But I want to move to the question of epistemology, which I think comes up in a reading of Hegel as well as a reading of Elizabeth Anderson and John Rawls. And Miranda Fricker, from her book Epistemic Injustice, states, quote, "It is generally socially powerless groups that suffer hermeneutical marginalization. And so we can say that from the moral point of view, what is bad about this sort of hermeneutical marginalization is that the structural prejudice it causes in the collective hermeneutical resource is essentially discriminatory. The prejudice affects people in virtue of an aspect of their membership of a socially powerless group. And this in virtue of an aspect of their social identity. Let us call it structural identity prejudice. With this notion in place, we can now color our definition slightly differently so that it better conveys the discriminatory nature of hermeneutical injustice. Hermeneutical injustice is the injustice of having some significant area of one's social experience obscured from collective understanding owing to a structural identity prejudice in the collective hermeneutical resource, end quote. Taking this further, in Christy Dodson's conceptualizing epistemic oppression, the focus is on the damage done to an individual knower's ability to access epistemic resources and what happens when different forms of epistemic oppression are complicated by layers of impacts unforeseen by philosophers who seek idealized theories of subjectivity. She states, quote, "Reducible epistemic oppression, for example, can most often be addressed utilizing epistemic resources within that same epistemological system. Irreducible epistemic oppression, by contrast, which follows from features of epistemological systems, can only begin to be addressed through recognition of the limits of one's overall epistemological frameworks. First-order epistemic oppression results from insufficient shared epistemic resources like organizational schemata or instituted social imaginaries, which foster epistemic exclusions. Second-order epistemic oppression results from insufficient shared epistemic resources that produce salient epistemic exclusions. And third-order epistemic oppression falls from inadequate shared epistemic resources that foster epistemic exclusions. First and second-order epistemic oppression are reducible to historical formations, insofar as a major source of inertia in addressing them will be social, political, and historical landscapes. For third-order epistemic oppression, however, a major resistance to change will be features of the epistemological system itself. And that is the crux of the problem, that being able to name what is being obscured by the impediment of racism, the impediment of not leveling the playing field in terms of the valuation of black subjectivity, for example, obscures what actually one does not know. And so in thinking about what I'm calling a prolegomena on architecture and race theory, what I'm saying is that with architecture and space operating as critical mediators of visual and literary imaginations and fantasies, architecture itself emerges as a projected political and theoretical force in social relations. Urban design and architecture by indigenous Americans leverage the imperatives of democratic ideals while also applying architectural ideologies to populations who have come to know and achieve freedom, that substantial social freedom that Hegel talks about, through deprivation and abject violence. If there is to be an architecture race theory, then it necessarily may not be constituted from within the disciplinary boundaries of architecture, precisely because of the third-order epistemic problem that's pointed out by Christy Dodson, and precisely because the insularity of the discipline's approach to racial ideology and social freedom. Therefore, alternate sites and products of black cultural production must be marshaled to buttress a new conception of space and visuality that is critically inclusive of blackness as a theoretic. That conception rests upon new protocols of the imaginary that are catalytic in the formation and evolution of blackness as it maps its course through the politicized social field, the paradoxical aesthetic domain of modernism, and the expansive economic and legal space of the post-industrial black city. With the whitened suburb and the blackened inner city in place, with their differentiated architecture serving as a visual indices of race, architecture race theory can help to theoretically address these domains. Now, although critical race theory and critical race psychology have codified a discursive space, disciplines closer to architecture and urbanism have had problems establishing similar terrain. MCA Chicago curator Naomi Beckwith states, quote, "The greatest problem facing art discourse now is that its political handicap extends from the art object to the art world itself." We lack the language to discuss the very art world structures that prevent the development of more useful terms about race or other minority identities, end quote. In shaping an architecture race theory, I'm hoping to draw sharp boundaries, consolidate and organize work already accomplished, and bring clarity to positions, terms of engagement, and the politics of discourse. Yet simultaneously, the move should not be seen as a conjoining of radical or a radical black aesthetics with architecture race theory, but rather a corrective against the rampant invisibility that blackness occupies in current discourse. The first order of an architecture race theory should be built around three principles, I believe. First, correcting the invisibility of raciality in the canonical histories of European modernism. Secondly, pedagogical demarcations between the advancement of market-based logics within architectural typologies and non-market-based typologies and topologies. Third, an insistence on dynamic and contested definitions of the commons as an enduring public right, separate from what has come to be defined as, quote, public space. Second order principles of an architecture race theory would catalyze theorizing about the transition problem of moving from non-ideal to ideal versions of the urban, the city, and the metropolitan. And they would entail an interrogation of epistemic injustice and epistemic oppression in specific sites and territories. An interrogation of mediated architecture, how black subjects are depicted in space. An insistence on resource distribution coupled with social hierarchy overhaul. And finally, an interrogation of the spatial implications of the movement of capital and the distribution of justice. With that in place, I'm personally interested in, once that's set up, in producing and curating intellectual content in the form of projects, text, media, etc. that interrogates new forms of black spatial aesthetics in cities, permanent alternative public spheres, and alternative black public spheres, and a blackness-infused, black subjectivity-infused conception of disavowal, something that I believe in Detroit we need very desperately. We have to disavow the city that we loved in the past and move towards something different. And that process of disavowal is very difficult. So with that, I close, and I hope you have great questions.
So now we have time for Q&A, and
I work.
okay.
I have a quick, naive question. What is a black aesthetic or a black spatial aesthetic? I'm struggling with that concept.
Sure. I mean, this is a piece by Kara Walker. I think one can approach that question in a couple of different ways. The way that I'm trying to articulate the coming into being of black aesthetics is that producing architecture through the methodologies of European modernism presents an epistemic constraint on imagination. And so changing the framework with what I'm calling architecture race theory would present a context by which we can revisit methodologies of architectural production. Not unlike the process that black artists in the last 15 or 20 years, since the Whitney Biennial show that Thelma Golden curated and works and artists that have come out of the generation that are now in their 50s, and then another group coming up, the Carol Walkers, the Gary Simmons, the Glenn Ligons, Lorna Simpson. They're using, in some cases, methods that are European-based art methods to produce art, and within that constraint, within that epistemic constraint, they're producing a new language or new languages of Black aesthetics. I think what's happening in what some call post-Black art is trying to shed those constraints of methodology, of derivation, of derivative aesthetic methodologies, and to produce something that is a Black aesthetic that doesn't emerge out of the conventional narrated scripts of European art-based methods for producing art. That's what I'm trying to think about in architecture, and we're not where those artists are. We're not where that generation or those couple generations of artists are in terms of thinking through Black aesthetic. Does that answer?
Well, what you help me to see is what it's not. And what it's not find around, which is the present European, constraints. But I'm still struggling with what is it, or what is it really evolved into as a representation of Black aesthetics.
But I think, right, but I think someone like, my friend Fred Milton would say, I don't want to define it. Because once we define it, then commodification, exploit, co-optation, et cetera, takes place. So I think on the one hand, you could say, it's something that should be resistant to definition. And that's another way to look at it.
So I'm a poet, so I'm thinking about this in terms of language. So I think you said Black language to discuss the structures in the art world, and the visual art world, that create these epistolary hierarchies of race. So I'm wondering, like Kara Walker or something, are there people like you who have had to provide language to the structures that, say, create epistolary hierarchies in poetics? Or was there someone before Kara Walker that was a theorist that was saying, these are the structures? Does that sort of answer the question? Did that sort of ask the question? I don't take a lot of theory classes, so looking for like a list of things, yeah.
So, just so I'm clear, so you're asking, so in the art world, the quote that I read from Naomi Beckman was the language they lack, or the art world lacks language to discuss simultaneously particular art pieces, but also the relationship between those pieces and the art world itself.
Right.
And so your question is,
was there someone, because you talked about in the architectural world, your interests are to provide a language around that discussion because it's not there to develop these theories. Do you think there were writers or theorists that did that or are doing that in the visual art world or in the world of poetics?
Sure. I think that, yeah. I mean, I mentioned I went through. I didn't go through as many art people, but yeah, people like Darby English and Huey Copeland, and others, and curators as well, because curators write they frame the shows, they write the text and the catalog. So I think people like Franklin Sermons, Norma Golden, Naomi Beckwith, are all articulating, and certainly Oakley and Weezer, are all articulating this transformation that's happening in the art world. I'm thinking of Document 11, the text by Oakley and Weezer on platforms of democracy. Amazing kind of articulation of how, and then the Venice Biennale that he curated last year, just making constant interventions in how to think about art, new art that's being produced in the context of race and politics. So yeah, I think there are pretty good. mentioned there are people. I'm not the only. There are people in architecture who are taking this up. And I think part of the impetus to do this project is I think they're going to get marginalized unless the category, the subdisciplinary area, is made credible. And so there is wonderful work. We started great work in Appendix Journal, which was the only African American, Black American editorial editors with a peer-reviewed architecture journal, critically productive, is now, in this span of time, the only journal edited by Black persons, double-blind peer-reviewed, with people on the board who are diverse. So, Appendix was 1993, we're now in 2016. The discourse has not, the pace of the discourse has not accelerated. And I think part of that is the venues to publish. So we're, pretty productive is one place. But, I see there's work on something called Aggregate, which is a kind of architectural historians web-only platform. There's some work there. But I think unless it's codified, what we've seen in the discipline is unless it's codified as a thing, it's going to get marginalized and actually not accessed. And once that marginalization takes place within the academy, students don't seek it out because it's not what's on syllabi, it's not what is quoted by professors. So this is very much to set a light structure around some work that's already developing, it's already codified. Let that fall into that structure and let new work emerge. But if we don't codify the disciplinary field, it's either going to be marginalized or it's going to be co-opted by someone else. That's just my cynical view.
First, thank you very much. You expanded my universe. Took me from sort of naive ideas of modeling effects, assertion that space is socially constructed, all the way through Doreen Masters of human geography and looking at space as gender. But one of the points of access that I have to kind of extremely expansive work here is Hegel. And I find Hegel to be a somewhat problematic tool, particularly when you're trying to get to a definition of some kind of freedom or autonomy. And I kept hearing, resonating in my head, along with a bunch of other things, something about the Marxist critique of Hegel, and specifically the concept of freedom from her work on Hegel theory and universalism. And when you try to, this brought up an issue I was having with constant and broad negotiation between theory and history in my school of thought. If the historian says Hegel, and you're looking at an idea of race being invented in order to reserve freedom and autonomy for white working subjects, in order to exclude the Haitian Revolution from their worldview and their epistemologies. Hegel was writing at a time when architecture and urban planning were very specifically evoking a kind of national identity for Germany, for a German state, filtered through Greek classical architecture. So I'm trying to fast forward a little bit to this idea of can there be a post-racial architectural practice when one of the tools is finding particularity within what is somewhat to Hegel universalizing white identity with that particular epistemological.
Sure. Well, thanks for the question. So first of all, Hegel, Haiti, Universal History by Susan Buck Morris. As you said, that focuses primarily on the master-slave dialectic. Plus, the work from Hegel that I look at is focused on social theory. And if you, I'm sure if you were to go back, so I was going through a lot of things, but to read the text, what I was doing was teasing out a very particular, from a very, his opus work, very particular piece, which was at the end of the day, what is the individual's relationship to the institution? And criticizing Hegel, that's what I was doing in terms of saying, you know, he talks about the institution, the practical identities, the relationship, finding, going out into public and finding verification, affirmation of identity through interacting with institutions. What I'm critiquing is the universality, the presumed universality of that construction, of that conception. And so I'm not saying in fact, I'm saying the opposite. I'm not saying that is the primary conception of how we should think about someone attaining social truth. What I'm saying is it's fraught with, particularly the kinds of things that Susan brings out in Master Slave Narrative, intellectual blindness, right? Intellectual blindness towards race and towards the kind of institutions that one would face as a racial subject. I think with respect to post-racial, I don't think we should be seeking that. I don't think it's productive. I don't see where it goes. I think I'd rather see us flip the dynamic from, you know, race is racism, right? Because that conflation, when we talk about race or diversity and equity, inclusion, all these things, the starting point is race and racism are conflated. And I think we bring those apart and say, out of black subjectivity comes a productive contribution to humanism as such. Out of white subjectivity can come contributions to humanism as such. And so I think, you know, we look at the kind of, you know, Du Bois calls it the double consciousness, but I could also call it the kind of disembodiment that black subjects have had to endure, having to go outside of the body to some other place to reach affirmation for something that your body is not going to achieve in the society that you're in the institutions that are supposed to affirm you in Hegel's ideal world of, you know, of social theory. What can white people learn from that? I mean, what can other people learn from that? I think a lot. So I think there's notions that if we start to unpack subjectivity, we can find a lot of productive areas that will be productive for all of us, as opposed to always gluing together race with racial animals. And I think that's the proposition when we talk about, you know, what is a work like this doing? You know, it's not just doing something for me, it's doing something for everybody. So the work produced is not in a vacuum. I think that, you know, in identity, I wouldn't say it's I don't think, again, post-racial, I don't think it's productive, but I think a more sophisticated level of identity representation and identity sophistication, how to receive and unpack identity is, I think, a more productive place than simply thinking about an ideal post-racial. Does that answer?
Your case study, you spent a lot of time talking about Detroit. I grew up in Detroit. I grew up in the Detroit area. You zap a little bit, say you've done to put all the money in that 7 miles you talked about. And you spent a lot of time talking about the history of urban renewal and its failures, particularly about the public housing in Chicago. So can you give us some ideas of what would be a productive project? Let's take Detroit as an example. What would be productive projects to try to overcome this tension, which is really, I grew up in Detroit, there's a really visceral tension. There used to be a real tension between the suburbs and the city. So what would be productive projects? I mean, what could architects do for urban renewal that would be better than what we do?
Yeah, question. I think that's had a good conversation with some students earlier today. I think, you know, the context for urban development has really changed over the last 20 years. And a lot of it has to do with capital. Because of real estate investment trusts and, real estate used to be a family business. Every city, every region had a developer. They did malls, they did housing, et cetera. When we moved to a REIT structure, which allowed for larger pools of capital to be amassed and for an investment vehicle for people who wanted to invest in a real estate company, not a project, because projects are very risky. Getting people to invest in a single project is very risky. But if you smooth that risk over a broad level of projects and you're investing in big enough projects, the risk reward, works out better. So with that change came large scale development, stadium developments. We're having one stadium being constructed right now, like I mentioned. In a lot of cities, this is the way that projects are built. The paradox is, in a city like Detroit, you have a bankrupt city that then finds, the state finds $450 million in bonds, plus other tax incentives, exemptions, et cetera, to put into essentially a private stadium that will add building development value to a franchise, sports franchise. We were at a moment in Detroit several years ago under Mayor Dave Bing when he started something called Detroit Future City. And the conversation began to go into terminologies like right-sizing the city. Because again, Detroit is 140 square miles. And that conversation in compiling data and everything led to, maybe there's just parts of the city that we don't invest in anymore and we concentrate investments in other areas. And that led to, you're trying to move me out and here's urban renewal and here's the distrust that comes, rightly so, from black communities. But I think that was precisely the point, to rethink the role of design, the role of architecture, the role of urban design, in actually saying, no, let's have that conversation, and yes, moving would actually be better than staying, because here's the thing. The architecture, public space, the civic space, the urban design, that would be better than the current conditions where you're living. And to put the kind of public policy backing and legal signature behind that to make people whole or to have them participate as equity owners in the projects that they come into. I think that conversation would have been very productive. It would have been politically fraught. But at the same time, I think, we're investing in places, 10 miles this way, 15, that logically does not make sense. But because it's easier politically to do that, to basically kind of put some crumbs everywhere while the center is getting massive investment, and so a lot of it subsidized, that's where we are. So I think in a lot of cities, and we talked, or began to talk about kind of the presidential candidates, this is not 2008. Whoever's elected is going to come out with a plan for cities, plan for the inner cities. And here we go, back to the war on poverty, back to the war on crime, back to Johnson, Nixon, Carter. Let's see what toolkit is brought out for that, whether it's enterprise zones, empowerment zones. We really need to look closely at what is going to be the project for solving what, unfortunately, the police unions have brought to the fore, which is dysfunctionality of so many municipalities in integrating parts of the city that house black residents, for black residents, into the advancement of the city as a whole. Charlotte was a great example. Detroit was a great example. I mean, if you come to Midtown Detroit, you think, my God, I can't getting to a restaurant on Friday night for 2 hours, 3 hours. But then there's another Detroit, right? So I think that that's where we are in these cities, and it's going to take massive investment. But I'm cynical, again, cynical, but trying to work to advance different modalities, different ideas. Cynical about the toolkit that folks will go back to try to, quote, solve the problem in the inner city.
One more time. Maybe one more question, no? All right, well, just one question and then
So I noticed that you used the language of ideal and non-ideal theory.
Yeah.
I wonder if it implies any teleology or idea of like urban utopia that's informing what you define as productive or productive, or it's just like anti-racism or anything like that that's informing what you say is productive. What do you think of ideal?
Yeah, primarily keying on the question that, sorry, which one? Yeah, the question that you asked, I'm really looking at, philosophers who are making incredible interventions in now starting to hone in on actual realities, not ideal. And that's where, and they're honing in on the ideal, not ideal, pretty heavily in terms of people like Meredith Kirker, Christy Dodson, Jason Stanley, who's working on propaganda, Sally Haslanger, Peter Relton, who's at Michigan as well, Elizabeth Ames. That's primarily where I'm trying to tee off of the interest in saying, let's stop kidding ourselves with this false notion that, you take the opportunities that are given, if you take the basic set of packages that are given by society, you can be anything you want to be. We know that the statistics of social science, everything tells us that's not possible. So let's start dealing with the reality as opposed to the idealization. And that, using that as a starting point as opposed to something that's an aberration or something that, that's where we are at this point in time. But theoretically speaking, 100 years from now, the ideal would still fit, and where the actual position of culture would change, right? So the ideal seems as kind of as stable, and then the reality shifts. But I think what these philosophers, this group of philosophers, is doing is saying, no, the ideal actually can shift, which I think is an amazing contribution to shifting our thinking around ideal and not ideal.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you have a question and you think this, which you can come outside. I think we're going to be right in the hallway, right in the entrance, and